Ah, my goodness, you frightened me. Sorry about that. I've just been a little bit on edge since I watched Season 2 of Made in Abyss. Why, just yesterday I walked out into my garden, saw a little mole hole and ran screaming for the nearest church to beg for comfort from whatever god was listening. And speaking of churches, I have a confession to make. I never actually wanted to watch this season. I was always going to, of course, like when I stumble delirious into the kitchen at 3 a.m. and say, surely I won't eat this entire tube of Pringles, and then wake up the next morning with crumbs surrounding me and my hand still firmly lodged into the now empty can like a victim in the scene of a debauched murder case, but I was certainly reluctant. I had heard from correspondents, you see, that the second season would contain imagery even more disturbing than that of the film, which to me sounded like the claims of madmen. How could you get more disturbing than a film that contained parasites crawling out of the eye sockets of laughing corpses, unanesthetized amputation, and a point-of-view vivisection sequence? You wouldn't, would you, Made in Abyss? You wouldn't. No, you would. Would you? You would. You would. So I was, and this isn't a joke, genuinely fairly apprehensive about watching this season. There are twin dragons responsible there. I'm quite bad with horror despite my incredibly Chad-like stature, largely owing to the fact that constant apprehension that something is bound to go wrong is what I usually go to entertainment to get away from rather than indulge in. In a way, it's quite like Re:Zero, which is a series I dropped specifically because of this aspect of the experience. If I feel like I can never let my guard down, I end up constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Made in Abyss has built up a brand that relies on things going terribly, horribly wrong at a moment's notice without a lot of tension building beforehand, sort of like how most people I talk to feel when I suddenly talk about my issues with Persona 5, which of course means every moment is tense. And it won't spare you the details either. You can expect a front and center seat in the splash zone to the worst it can throw at you. It's almost genuinely impressive how macabre things have gotten that I now look back at that attempted amateur amputation from Season 1 as a quaint little skip through Tiny Baby Lane. Not really though, that was a joke. Now, I should clarify that this isn't a bad thing. More than most measures of enjoyment, this is especially subjective to my experience. It's a core part of why the show is so compelling, and there's certainly an element of realism to the things just suddenly go south with no prior warning element, given how young our protagonists are. Why, poor Queenie found out just a few months ago how quickly things can go wrong. Terrible shame, that. Oh, give me a moment, I apologize, I'm obligated by law. 5 seconds of silence for Mum. Right, back to it. So we're picking up where we left off from Dawn of the Deep Soul in this one, and I do mean literally right where we left off, with Reg, Nanachi, and Riko finally descending into the 6th layer in that odd, magical, dumbwaiter thing, meaning this is finally, genuinely, the point of no return for our intrepid little spelunkers. There is no coming back from this layer of the abyss. I didn't expect then that this would be the most socially inclined season yet. The amount of side characters explodes in this one. There's more character interaction than there's been since the initial few episodes in Orth, and a great deal of the initial goings-on revolve around trying to navigate this bizarre new culture they've found themselves in, which is a marked departure from previous seasons, where the Abyss itself was the closest thing to an antagonist the series had. That is, of course, something they pivoted away from with Bondrewd in the film, and are evidently carrying forwards. We've gone from archaeology to anthropology, in essence, complete with a new language, so everyone sounds like a character from Banjo-Kazooie, which is probably the most marked change in this season when compared to the older ones. The Abyss itself takes something of a back seat, with this season taking place, as it does, entirely on one layer. At risk of making a joke in bad taste, I'd say this is more about the group's internal politics, eh? Alright, fine. Instead of contending with the inherent danger of the Abyss itself, Rig, Riko, and Nanachi find themselves confronting people warped by their exposure to it. Where the film was about one individual in particular who was, to put it lightly, a little bit kooky, instead we see a culture where things are going on strangely well. It's very impressive that the recurring themes and tone of the series remain consistent even with the shifts in narrative focus toward a broader cast of characters, if only for this season, I don't know. I haven't read the manga. Reg's really the star here more than Riko or Nanachi, and we finally see his amnesia catch up to him in proper fashion, and I think it's very well timed that we finally get to start peeling the layers off of the mystery surrounding him now that we're this far in. Riko spends the lion's share of her time interacting with a new cast of characters, the original Cave Raiders, who we see frequently in flashbacks. These characters are rather heavily implied, read overtly stated to be the denizens of the Golden City in which our intrepid little dudes find themselves, which is more than a little bit unnerving since they all look like horrible slugs. As we know what they turned into and know what they looked like before, the horrifying mystery of what happened to them to make them this way is arguably the main emotional draw of the season. It's as if we're being shown the cover of an Animorphs book, but the interstitial phases of transformation from human to animal have been removed. Well, how in God's name did that ever happen, we ask, looking at the little starfish, whilst not really wanting to know the answer. Of course, that's not going to deter Made in Abyss, never knowing, as we do, when next the show will elect to torture us with horrific imagery. After episode 10 of the original season, I twitch every time there's a cut. It almost seems like the creators delight in taunting us. Here, look at my cool new characters. Would you like to find out what happens to them? No. Oh dear. Well, that's unfortunate, because I'm going to anyway. Okay. I do think it's pertinent to give fair warning. Episodes 7 and 8 are some of the most affecting body horror the series has yet shown us, which is very funny because this is the show wherein we saw the aforementioned first-person vivisection sequence. It was rather viscerally horrible to the point where words began to fail me, which is a hugely impressive feat to achieve given my usual proclivity towards never shutting up. I suppose I ought to keep them in my mind just in case my barber attempts to start a conversation about conspiracy theories again. This played a big part into why I was so reluctant to watch it as well. Correspondents had consistently reinforced that this was as gut-wrenchingly sickening as the show had yet been, which, given that's a very high bar to clear, certainly did get me looking to camera and saying, well, alright, hold on, just a moment. However, something stuck out at me when I watched it. I disagree with those people who suggested that the goings-on of Season 2 are worse to watch than the things beforehand. My real sticking point is less with the psychological aspects of The Abyss, which I tend to take in greater stride, and more with the visceral depictions of physical pain and suffering, which, weirdly, this arc has less to do with. Whilst the goings-on were certainly abhorrent, I didn't find myself unable to breathe in the same way some of the moments in the first season and the film especially prompted me to, and that's mostly to do with how it's presented. The flashback episodes, I would say, definitely constitute the most graphically awful things to happen in the series so far, on paper at least, and yet the presentation is oddly fairy tale-like. This makes it substantially more macabre, and continues, as it does, Abyss' fascination with depicting the most grotesque happenings in oddly whimsical ways. There's something disarming about how these sequences are presented to the viewer, similarly to how the vivisection in Deep Soul was overlaid with a rolling melody, and less emphasis on the moment-to-moment suffering of the individual in question. Compared to the in-the-moment abject horror of the amputation attempts in the first season and of course the film, this was more dreamlike, and as a result it didn't hit me in the same way. I suppose that's the strength of Abyss in a nutshell though, is horror presented through a jarringly gentle lens. Now, that isn't to say it didn't still hit me. It's certainly unique to my readily admitted limited experience. Compared to something like Alien, for example, if you watch Alien, it's horror, so when horrible things happen, you're not as taken aback because it's part of what you signed on for. They don't put violin and gently sung vocals over the chestburster sequence. Comparatively, somehow Made in Abyss always, even with my guard up, manages to present horror that just feels grippingly unique. It's almost beautiful in its own twisted way. Were I someone who enjoyed that sort of thing, I would probably be more appreciative of the length it goes to. When this strange Furby with a hairy old man's ass crushes Mania's eyeball out, you know he's not doing it out of malice. The act is innocent, but the results are horrific, and when retribution is visited, you feel awful for everyone involved. It's a casual nightmare that's normal for everyone but our visiting main characters, which is one of the most consistently impactful elements of the series. It really highlights the tragedy of the characters involved, rather than the shock value, I think, which makes it more disturbing and more poignant. For all the times I've wanted to look away watching this bloody show, I've never once found myself able to. And just like in the past, once again, Kevin Penkin has somehow composed a score that perfectly encapsulates every emotional note it needs to meet whilst effortlessly matching the tone of the series. I've been listening to Evan Call's soundtrack to Violet Evergarden again recently, and it's again stressed for me just how much good incidental music adds to any series they're used for, and Penkin's work on Abyss ranks as perhaps the finest example I can think of. It's such a huge part of the atmosphere, I genuinely can't imagine what the series would be like without his haunting, ethereal score. It's as important as the visuals, sublimely impressive stuff. One of the reasons why I finally took the plunge on Season 2 was my desperation to hear the soundtrack in its proper context, and I was very much not disappointed. Given that each member of the main cast goes on a much more individual journey this time, the tone can afford to swing in quite a few more directions than it could previously. Nanachi continues on as part of the regular crew until they aren't, and their story is one of coming to terms with loss. Reg and Rico largely go their separate ways too. Reg primarily struggles with his amnesia whilst interacting with newcomer Fapta and takes the chance to touch on concepts like identity and family, whereas Rico navigates the past of the Golden City and those trapped within it, bringing her peculiar brand of ceaseless optimism and determination to the social environment of the Golden City. It gives each of them chances to shine in ways not dependent on the other characters, and it also gives more importance to showing how well they work as a team once they're back together. I was initially very repulsed by the season's decision to once again focus on Rico's bathroom antics in the first episode, but fortunately it's kept to a minimum, thank Christ for that. She is, for the most part, just as fundamentally innocent and insane as she was before, but this time there's nary a piss tube in sight. You take your victories where you can find them, I suppose. I mentioned back when I reviewed the first season that Rico's blasé approach to the horrors of the Abyss was a huge part of why it hit so powerfully, but as the show continues, I'm finally starting to understand that she's more the horror protagonist who doesn't realize she's in a horror. The nightmares the Abyss presents are incidental, rarely the focus, so this shift to a more focused narrative with personal stakes beyond simply survival is a welcome change. Which brings me to an uncomfortable realization about my tumultuous relationship with Made in Abyss. I think I might struggle to recommend it going forwards. Not to say it's bad by any stretch of the imagination, it is in fact exquisite, but when I think about what it is I'm recommending, it's hard to say I don't have reservations about it. Exposing people to basically guaranteed misery, even very artistic misery, has never really been my intent. With every new horror, the scales tip ever so slightly further. If you're already on board, it's definitely worth continuing, but going through the whole thing, there's a lot of stuff a first-time viewer is going to have to endure. And this is where I think I need to again reassert my inexperience in the field of this sort of thing. I imagine this kind of beauty and horror vibe is certainly not unique to Made in Abyss, but I simply lack the wider experience of the genre to know many other examples. As I've belabored over and over again over the course of this review, I don't typically engage with horror, I don't enjoy it. It's not a genre from which I derive pleasure, unlike watching the pretty vampire lady from Call of the Night, or the rush of social connection I feel every time I say hello in a Final Fantasy XIV dungeon and someone says hello back. It's perhaps fitting for a show I genuinely appreciate and respect, and that largely focuses on the oxymoronic relationships that I went over in great length in the Dawn of the Deep Soul review, that my own relationship with it has become rather oxymoronic as well. It's something I think is superlative, artistic, and at times profound, and yet it's also something I struggle to bring myself to watch. The idea of looking for a light in the darkness is thrown around a lot, and I really think that's the series' smoking gun as to its theme, this idea of finding beauty and solace in aberrant places. It wasn't exactly hiding it before, but this idea of seeming opposites coming together and creating a haunting, peaceful nightmare is so instrumental to how it feels, and now the protagonists literally can't go back if they wanted to. All they can do is press further into the darkness, both excited and nervous to see what happens next, so I suppose in that sense both they and I are past the point of no return. I wonder how Season 3 will traumatize me. Let's find out together, shall we?